The Wilderness of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, is not a forest in any ordinary sense of the word. It is roughly 70 square miles of second-growth scrub oak, stunted pine, and thorned undergrowth so dense that a man on horseback could pass within 30 yards of an infantry regiment and never see it. On April 30th, 1863, the largest and best-equipped army the United States had ever assembled marched into that thicket, and its commander, Major General Joseph Hooker, sent word to his officers that the enemy must now either flee or come out and fight on ground of Hooker's choosing. He is widely quoted as saying that his plans were perfect and that God should have mercy on General Lee, because he, Hooker, would have none. He had 133,000 men. Robert E. Lee had barely 60,000, hungry, short of shoes, and pinned between two wings of a Union army that outnumbered him more than 2 to 1. Every professional soldier in North America understood what was supposed to happen over the next 72 hours. Instead, within 4 days, Hooker's army was retreating back across the Rappahannock River in a rainstorm, having suffered roughly 17,000 casualties, and the Battle of Chancellorsville had entered the military textbooks as the most audacious victory of the entire war. It turned on a single day, May 2nd, when 28,000 Confederate soldiers marched 12 miles across the front of the Union Army in daylight, and were seen doing it repeatedly by Union officers who reported exactly what they were looking at. And still the blow landed as a total surprise. The fog in the title of this video was not weather. What it actually was and why it worked is the story of this battle, and I will come back to it because the answer is stranger than fog. There is also a volley of rifle fire at the end of this story, fired in darkness at about 9 in the evening, that arguably decided the outcome of the entire war. It was not fired by the North. Here is what this video will walk through. First, the exact route of the flank march, a woods road serving an iron furnace, known in detail to essentially one local family, and how a chaplain and a mapmaker found it in the middle of the night. Second, the single order Hooker issued days before the battle that stripped his own army of its eyes, sending roughly 10,000 cavalrymen away from the field at the precise moment he needed them most. Third, the 3 separate specific warnings that reached Union commanders on the afternoon of May 2nd, including pickets who watched the Confederate column cross a clearing and counted its guns, and why each warning was explained away. Fourth, the collapse of the Union 11th Corps, roughly 2 miles of front rolled up in about 2 hours, reconstructed almost hour by hour, beginning with deer and rabbits bolting out of the tree line ahead of the attackers. And fifth, the night reconnaissance on the mountain road, the volley from the 18th North Carolina, and what the loss of one man that evening cost the Confederacy 14 months later. A note on sources before we begin. What follows draws on the official records of the war, the published accounts of officers on both sides, and the work of the historians who have mapped this battlefield yard by yard. Above all, Stephen Sears and Ernest Ferguson, whose books on Chancellorsville reconstruct the 2nd of May almost minute by minute. Where the record is disputed, and at Chancellorsville several moments are, I will say so rather than paper over it. Start with the plan, because Hooker's plan deserves its reputation. It was genuinely excellent, and so was the army he built to execute it. When Hooker took command in late January of 1863, he inherited a force demoralized by the slaughter at Fredericksburg and the humiliating mud march that followed, an army losing men to desertion at a rate of roughly 200 a day. In 3 months, he transformed it. He fixed the rations, adding fresh bread and vegetables. He overhauled the hospitals, granted furloughs on a rotating system to staunch the desertions, gave each corps its own distinctive badge to build unit pride, and crucially for our story, he created something the Army of the Potomac had never had, a professional intelligence service, the Bureau of Military Information under Colonel George Sharp, which by April was producing an estimate of Lee's strength accurate to within a few thousand men, a stunning improvement over the McClellan era, when Allen Pinkerton's operatives had routinely doubled and tripled Confederate numbers. Hooker knew, with unusual precision, exactly how badly he outnumbered Lee, which makes what followed all the more remarkable. Through the winter, The Army of the Potomac had sat on the north bank of the Rappahannock opposite Fredericksburg, staring at the heights where it had been slaughtered the previous December, at Marie's Heights, where 14 separate brigade assaults had broken against a stone wall without one Union soldier reaching it. A frontal assault was unthinkable, so Hooker split his force. Roughly 40,000 men under John Sedgwick would remain at Fredericksburg, demonstrating loudly, holding Lee's attention. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Army, the 5th Corps under George Meade, the 11th under Oliver Otis Howard, the 12th under Henry Slocum, with the 2nd Corps to follow, would march far upriver, cross the Rappahannock at Kelly's Ford, and then the Rapidan at Germanna and Ely's Fords beyond Lee's flank, and come down on the Confederate rear through the Wilderness. The march itself was a masterpiece of logistics. 40,000 men crossed 2 rivers in 3 days, April 27th through the 29th, carrying 8 days of rations on their backs to reduce the wagon train, and Lee did not learn the true scale of the movement until it was nearly complete. By April 30th, the maneuver had worked almost flawlessly. 4 Union corps were concentrated around a single large brick house and crossroads called Chancellorsville, which was not a town at all but one building, the Chancellor family's combination residence and tavern, 10 miles behind Lee's line, and Lee now faced enemies in overwhelming strength on 2 sides. Union soldiers cheered as they realized what their army had done. One more day of marching would carry them out of the forest and into open country around Banks's Ford, where their numbers and their superb artillery, over 400 guns, could be brought to bear, and Lee would face a choice between retreat toward Richmond and destruction where he stood. That was the morning of May 1st. At around 11 o'clock, Union columns pushing east along the Orange Turnpike, George Sykes's division of regulars in the lead, ran into Confederate infantry under Lafayette McLaws advancing toward them, because Lee, informed by his cavalry of the true situation, had done the thing that made no arithmetic sense. He had left about 10,000 men under Jubal Early to watch Sedgwick's 40,000 at Fredericksburg, and marched everything else straight at the larger enemy wing. Even the digging tells you something about the 2 commanders that morning. Lee's engineers had spent the previous night entrenching a line near Zoan Church, on high open ground astride the turnpike, because Lee understood that if he could not stop the Union army inside the Wilderness, the battle was already lost. The Union advance guard was actually winning the opening fight, holding good open ground, Sykes's regulars trading volleys on ridgeline the army needed, when Hooker ordered a withdrawal back into the Wilderness to take up a defensive line around Chancellorsville. His own corps commanders protested. Meade reportedly exclaimed that if the army could not hold the top of a hill, it certainly could not hold the bottom of it. The order stood. From that moment, an army of 130,000 men surrendered the initiative to an army of 60,000 and pulled itself back into terrain where its advantages in men and guns meant almost nothing, because in the Wilderness, artillery had no fields of fire and a battle line could not see 50 yards. Darius Couch, Hooker's senior corps commander, went to headquarters that evening and came away, as he later wrote, believing that his commanding general was a whipped man. Whether Hooker lost his nerve or genuinely believed Lee would break himself against Union entrenchments is still argued. Hooker himself, years later, is said to have admitted simply that for once he lost confidence in Hooker. What matters is the position it created. The Union line now bent around Chancellorsville in a great arc nearly 6 miles long, and its western end, held by the 11th Corps under Howard, simply stopped in the middle of the forest, facing south, anchored on nothing. 2 regiments and 2 guns were bent back to face west at the very end of the line, a gesture at security rather than the thing itself. In military language, the flank was in the air. Hooker rode the lines on the morning of May 2nd, and according to witnesses, told Howard's officers to look to their right. Howard, a devout, one-armed veteran of the peninsula who had lost the arm at 7 Pines, believed the tangled forest itself made an attack from the west impossible. He would spend the rest of his long life, through the Freedmen's Bureau and the founding of Howard University, defending his conduct on this one afternoon. and never persuasively. Now the mechanism, because the flank march of May 2nd did not begin with a bold stroke of genius on a map. It began with two men sitting on hardtack boxes at a crossroads in the dark. On the night of May 1st, Lee and Thomas Jonathan Jackson, the man the war had renamed Stonewall at First Manassas, met near the intersection of the Plank Road and the road running down to Catherine Furnace, a small ironworks owned by a local man named Charles Welford. The two generals sat on discarded Union cracker boxes beside a small fire, and the conversation that followed is among the most consequential in American military history. Cavalry under Fitzhugh Lee, the commanding general's nephew, had brought in the crucial discovery of the day. Fitz Lee had personally ridden to a vantage point overlooking the Union right and seen it with his own eyes. Howard's flank hanging unprotected in the woods, unfortified, facing the wrong direction, arms stacked, cattle being slaughtered for dinner. The question was how to reach it. A direct approach was impossible, since every road near the Union front was watched. So during the night, Jackson's mapmaker, Jedediah Hotchkiss, a New York-born schoolteacher turned topographer, whose maps of the Shenandoah Valley had made Jackson's 1862 campaign possible, and Jackson's chaplain, Beverly Tucker Lacey, who had family connections in the neighborhood, rode to the Welfords, and the furnace owner traced out a route his own haulers used, a track cut through the forest for dragging wood and iron ore, invisible on Union maps because it barely existed on any map. Welford's own son would ride along as a guide. Connected to the Brock Road, it would carry a column south, then west, then north in a long fishhook around the entire Union Army to the Orange Turnpike directly behind Howard's Corps. About 12 miles. When Hotchkiss laid it out on the hardtack boxes, Lee is recorded as asking Jackson what he proposed to make the movement with. Jackson answered, "With my whole corps." That meant roughly 28,000 men and over 100 guns, leaving Lee with perhaps 14,000 under McLaws and Richard Anderson to hold the front of an enemy 5 times his strength for an entire day. It was the second time in 72 hours Lee had divided his army in the face of superior numbers, and now it would be divided into 3 pieces, separated by miles of forest, unable to support one another. If Hooker attacked while the army was split, the Army of Northern Virginia would cease to exist by nightfall, and with it, in all probability, the Confederacy. Lee thought about it and said, "Well, go on." Here is the detail that battlefield summaries usually skip, and it is the hinge of everything. A 12-mile march by 28,000 men, with artillery and ambulances, is a column stretching for something like 6 miles that takes most of a daylight day to pass a single point. Jackson's men stepped off around 7:30 in the morning, hours later than he wanted, marching at his prescribed pace, 2 miles in 50 minutes with a 10-minute rest, under orders that stragglers were to be bayoneted rather than allowed to fall out and be captured with knowledge of the route. It could not be hidden in time. It could only be hidden in meaning. The wilderness would screen most of it, but not all of it, and Jackson knew there were gaps, particularly the open rise near the furnace itself, where the column would walk in full view of Union observers. The wager, the real wager of Chancellorsville, was not that the Union Army would fail to see the march. It was that the Union Army would see it, and conclude it meant something else. Which brings us to the 3 warnings, because Union soldiers did their jobs on May 2nd. It was their commanders who unmade the work. The first warning came before 9 in the morning. Where the Furnace Road crossed a stretch of open rising ground near Catherine Furnace, the marching column was visible from Hazel Grove, an elevation held by David Birney's division of the 3rd Corps, and observers reported a long line of infantry, artillery, and trains moving across the Union front, heading, as far as they could tell, south and west. Birney's artillery even opened fire on the column at long range, forcing Jackson's regiments to double time across the exposed stretch, and the report went up the chain to Hooker himself. And Hooker, to his credit, briefly considered the correct answer. Around 9:30, he sent a circular to Howard and Slocum stating in writing that he had good reason to suppose the enemy was moving to his right, and instructing them to take measures to resist an attack from the west, to advance their pickets and examine the ground. Howard later claimed never to have received it, though a copy survives in the official records and a reply over his signature exists. Whatever the truth of that dispute, nothing meaningful was done. No reserve shifted, no entrenchments turned, no line refused. Then the interpretation began to rot. A column moving south and west away from the battlefield fit a story Union headquarters badly wanted to believe, that Lee, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, was retreating toward Gordonsville and the railroad. Sharp's intelligence bureau had told Hooker that Lee's supply situation was desperate, which was true, and that truth now became the scaffolding of the fatal fiction. The sighting became evidence of victory. By afternoon, Hooker was wiring Sedgwick that the enemy was fleeing and to capture Fredericksburg and everything in it. The second warning was made of cannon fire. Around noon, 3rd Corps Commander Daniel Sickles, the most improbable general in the Army, a Tammany Hall congressman who before the war had shot his wife's lover dead across the street from the White House and become the first American acquitted on a plea of temporary insanity, got permission to attack the column near the furnace, and his men fell on its rear guard, capturing most of the 23rd Georgia Regiment, which had been posted as flank guard, and made it stand in an unfinished railroad cut. Nearly 300 prisoners in all. Union forces had now physically touched the flank march, taken pieces of it captive, and interrogated the prisoners, some of whom, by several accounts, taunted their captors that they would catch thunder before the day was out. And the result of the attack was to harden the wrong conclusion, because the column kept flowing away to the southwest, exactly as a retreating army would. And Sickles reported that he was pressing a retreating enemy, and asked for reinforcements to press harder. 2 of the moves made to support him actually deepened the disaster, pulling Barlow's brigade, the 11th Corps' only general reserve, away to the south, and drawing attention and troops toward the furnace at the very hour the real blow was assembling in the opposite direction. What no one at headquarters weighed properly was the direction of the roads themselves, that the Brock Road, after running south, turns, and that a column disappearing to the southwest at noon could be facing due east in line of battle by 5. The third warning came from the men who would pay for its dismissal. Through the afternoon, pickets and officers of the 11th Corps out beyond the Union right kept reporting movement in the woods to the west, the sound of axes, bugle calls, the glint of equipment. In some accounts, Confederate infantry crossing clearings in plain sight. Colonel John Lee of the 55th Ohio carried warnings personally to his division commander, Charles Devens, at least twice, and was met with the reply, in substance, that he was frightened, that Western Virginia troops saw ghosts. Devens, a Harvard-trained Massachusetts lawyer who would later serve as Attorney General of the United States, held to the retreat theory because his corps commander held to it, and neither would act without the other. Major Owen Rice of the 153rd Pennsylvania, out on the picket line, sent back a message whose text survives, that a large body of the enemy was massing in his front and begging for God's sake that dispositions be made to receive him. Captain Hubert Dilger, an 11th Corps artillery officer, a Baden-born professional gunner the men called Leather Breeches, rode out alone to see for himself, blundered into the Confederate lines, was chased back by cavalry, and carried what he had seen first toward Army headquarters, where a staff officer, by Dilger's later account, laughed at him and told him to take his fairy tale back to his own corps. The responses that survive in the record range from indifference to ridicule. Howard's headquarters at Dowdall's Tavern held to the retreat theory. Some 11th Corps soldiers spent that final hour cooking supper, rifles stacked, playing cards, with exactly 2 guns and a couple of regiments facing west, the direction from which, at that moment, 28,000 men were forming into a battle line 2 miles wide and 3 divisions deep, Rhodes in front, Colston behind him, A.P. Hill coming up in the third line, a formation that took 2 full hours to deploy in silence within earshot of the Union pickets. 3 warnings, each independent, each accurate. This is what the fog of the title actually was, and here the open loop closes. The army was hidden in plain sight not by weather, and not really even by the forest, but by a story. Union headquarters had decided Lee was retreating, and every fresh piece of evidence, including captured prisoners, was bent until it fit. Military writers ever since have used Chancellorsville as the textbook case of confirmation bias in war. Richard Hoyer, the CIA analyst whose Psychology of Intelligence analysis became the standard text on the subject, described exactly this failure mode, that analysts do not weigh evidence neutrally but assimilate it to existing beliefs. And Roberta Wohlstetter's landmark study of Pearl Harbor found the same anatomy. Signals in abundance, drowned not by silence but by an interpretation. The fog that no wind clears, because it is generated inside the observer. Now the 2 hours. At about 5:15 in the evening on May 2nd, with perhaps 2 hours of usable daylight left, Jackson, sitting his horse Little Sorrel beside Robert Rhodes, a 34-year-old Virginia Military Institute man commanding the lead division, took out his watch, asked if he was ready, and gave the order in a sentence. "You can go forward then." The first thing the Union 11th Corps knew of it was animals. Deer, rabbits, and foxes came bursting out of the western tree line through the camps, driven ahead of the advancing line, and some soldiers laughed and cheered the sight in the seconds before the bugles sounded behind the wildlife, and the woods came alive with the rebel yell rolling down 2 miles of front. The men facing that onrush deserved better than the mockery they got afterward. The 11th Corps had many German immigrant regiments, refugees of the failed 1848 revolutions among them, and northern newspapers spent weeks calling them the Flying Dutchman and worse. In fact, a corps of around 11,000, positioned facing south, was struck end-on from the west by nearly 3 times its number, which meant the Confederate battle line overlapped them entirely, and each Union regiment that turned to fight was wrapped on both sides within minutes. There is no formation in the drill book that survives that geometry. Individual units made stands. At Colonel Leopold von Gilsa's position near the Tally Farm, the 2 westward-facing regiments, the 54th New York and 153rd Pennsylvania, got off a few volleys before being swallowed. Dilger, the captain who had been laughed at that afternoon, fought his 6-gun Ohio battery in a rolling retreat down the turnpike, at one point working a single gun by hand with a scratch crew, firing canister into the pursuit at ranges under 100 yards, an action that later brought him the Medal of Honor. Howard himself, to his personal credit, rode into the flood with a national flag clamped under the stump of his amputated arm, trying to rally men who streamed past him. At the Bushbeck line near Dowdall's Tavern, a shallow line of rifle pits that happened to face the right direction, Adolphus Bushbeck's brigade and the fragments of others held for perhaps 20 minutes of point-blank fighting, long enough to matter, because every minute of daylight lost to the attackers was a minute the rest of Hooker's army gained. Then each stand dissolved into the general flood pouring east down the turnpike toward Chancellorsville. In roughly 2 hours, Jackson's attack rolled the Union flank back about 2 miles, took over 1,000 prisoners and 9 guns, and inflicted about 2,400 casualties on the 11th Corps before darkness, blown formations, and the tangled forest finally dragged it to a halt. Rhodes's and Colston's divisions so intermingled in the thickets that officers could no longer find their own regiments. It came within a mile or so of Hooker's own headquarters, and one of the war's strangest scenes played out there. A desperate charge by the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry down a forest road into the Confederate flank, and Union guns massed at Fairview and Hazel Grove firing blind into the darkening woods. And it is worth pausing on the arithmetic one more time, because this is the mechanism of the whole battle. All day, 14,000 men under Lee had bluffed, demonstrated, and skirmished so convincingly that 5 Union corps, some 70,000 men who were never seriously attacked, stood still. The victory at Chancellorsville was not won by superior force. There was no superior force. It was won by taking a risk so far outside the normal grammar of war that the other side's imagination refused to process the evidence of it. Which brings the story to the mountain road and the volley I promised you at the start. Jackson was not finished at nightfall. He wanted a night attack, almost unheard of in that war of black powder smoke and linear tactics, to drive on to the United States Ford Road and cut the Union Army off from the river crossings behind it, turning a defeat into an annihilation. Around 9 in the evening, he rode forward with a small party of staff officers and couriers, 8 or 9 riders, out beyond his own infantry on a narrow track called the Mountain Road, parallel to the turnpike, to scout the ground in the dark. Sporadic firing was rattling all along the lines, both armies blind and ragged with nerves, and Union shells were still falling in the woods. As Jackson's party rode back toward friendly positions, men of the 18th North Carolina Regiment of James Lane's brigade heard horses coming at them out of the darkness from the direction of the enemy, and fired. Jackson's engineer, Captain Keith Boswell, the man who was to have guided the night attack, was killed instantly. An officer in Jackson's party shouted that they were firing on their own men, and Major John Barry of the 18th, believing it a Union trick, is said to have answered, "Who gave that order? It's a lie. Pour it into them," and ordered the second volley. Jackson was hit 3 times, once through the right palm, twice in the left arm, one ball shattering the bone below the shoulder. He was carried off under artillery fire that swept the road, dropped at least once from the litter when a bearer was struck, and his arm was amputated that night by his medical director, Dr. Hunter McGuire, at a field hospital near Wilderness Tavern. In the same barrage, A.P. Hill, next in command, was disabled by a shell fragment, and command of the entire corps passed in the darkness to the cavalryman Jeb Stuart, who had never commanded infantry in battle. The night attack died on the mountain road with Boswell. When Lee heard, he said that Jackson had lost his left arm, but that he himself had lost his right. For a few days, Jackson seemed to rally, and then pneumonia set in, and on May 10, 1863, at Guinea Station, with his wife Anna and infant daughter at hand, he died, saying, according to those at his bedside, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." The battle went on without him, and the sequel matters. On the morning of May 3rd, in some of the most concentrated killing of the entire war, roughly 17,500 men falling in about 5 hours, a rate of casualties that rivals Antietam's worst, the Confederates reunited their wings and took the Chancellorsville clearing. They were helped decisively by another Union self-inflicted wound, Hooker's order to abandon Hazel Grove, the one piece of high ground that dominated the field, onto which Porter Alexander promptly crowded some 30 Confederate guns and shelled the Union line and headquarters at will. One of those solid shots struck a pillar of the Chancellor House against which Hooker was leaning, stunning him so badly he was insensible for a time, at the moment his army most needed a functioning commander, and he neither relinquished command nor exercised it. While 60-year-old Darius Couch was left to manage a withdrawal, he was forbidden to turn into a counterattack. Sedgwick, meanwhile, finally stormed Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg that same morning, taking in 15 minutes the wall that had broken the army in December, only to be stopped at Salem Church and squeezed back over the river. By May 6th, Hooker was back across the Rappahannock in the rain, over the protest of a majority of his own corps commanders in a midnight council of war. The North had lost roughly 17,000 men, the South roughly 13,000, a far heavier proportional cost for the smaller army, some 22% of Lee's entire force, veterans and officers the Confederacy had no way to replace. And the deeper cost ran forward in time. Chancellorsville convinced Lee, and much of the Confederacy, that his army could do essentially anything, and that conviction marched north with him into Pennsylvania 8 weeks later, to a crossroads town called Gettysburg, where on the 3rd day he ordered a frontal assault across a mile of open ground. The kind of order a living Stonewall Jackson, master of the flank, might have argued against. Historians will debate forever what Jackson would have done on the first evening at Gettysburg, when Richard Ewell, commanding what had been Jackson's corps, received Lee's discretionary order to take Cemetery Hill if practicable, and judged it not practicable. Jackson did not deal in discretionary hesitation. We cannot know. What we can say is that the volley on the mountain road removed the one commander whose entire method was finding the way around, at the exact moment the Confederacy was about to bet everything on going straight through. So step back and look at what Chancellorsville actually teaches, because it is not really a story about marching. Hooker's plan was better than Lee's position. Hooker's army was better supplied, better equipped, better informed, and more than twice as large. The Union lost at Chancellorsville because of decisions, each identifiable, each avoidable. The decision to send the cavalry away on George Stoneman's raid toward Richmond, 10,000 troopers who spent 2 weeks stalled by a flooded river and then wandered the Confederate rear, tearing up track that was repaired within days, accomplishing almost nothing, while leaving the army without the screen that would have tracked Jackson's column within an hour, because that is precisely what cavalry is for. The decision on May 1st to abandon open ground and pull back into the forest, handing the initiative to the smaller army and neutralizing 400 guns. The decision to read a flanking march as a retreat, and to keep reading it that way even after capturing prisoners from it, prisoners who all but announced what was coming. The decision at 11th Corps headquarters to dismiss the pickets who were, at that very hour, watching the attack assemble, and to humiliate the officers who insisted on reporting it. Remove any single one of those, and the most celebrated maneuver in American military history probably dies in the underbrush as a catastrophic gamble that split an outnumbered army 3 ways in front of an enemy who was paying attention. That is the uncomfortable center of this battle. Audacity gets the credit, and Jackson's march earns every page written about it. But audacity only worked because the other side had built a wall of assumption, and then defended the wall against its own soldiers' eyes. The fog that hid an army in plain sight on May 2, 1863, was manufactured entirely at Union headquarters, out of confidence. And it has never stopped being manufactured since, in boardrooms and intelligence agencies, and every institution that decides what the evidence means before the evidence arrives. If this kind of story is why you are here, the mechanism underneath the legend, subscribe to the War Room Files and tap the like button so the next one reaches you. And if you know someone who thinks battles are decided by numbers alone, this is the video to send them. I will see you in the next one.